The first time she squeezed the trigger, the world felt too loud and too close. The recoil slammed into her shoulder harder than she expected, jarring her entire frame. The target, barely 20 meters away, stood untouched, mocking her in silence. Her breathing was uneven, her grip too tight, and sweat trickled down her temples even though the morning air in the training yard was cool. She had always been an athlete, the kind of woman who could hold her own in a fight, sprint across rugged ground without tiring, or wrestle someone to the floor if needed. Close range had been her comfort zone. She thrived when she could feel the weight of her opponent, hear their breath, sense their next move. But here, with the rifle in her hands, the rules were different. Every mistake echoed. Every tiny movement sent her shot wandering. When she lowered the rifle, embarrassed, she saw the instructor watching from a distance. He was a retired Navy SEAL, the kind of man whose presence carried a quiet authority. He didn't flinch when others missed. He didn't scold. He simply observed, arms crossed, eyes hidden behind dark lenses, as though measuring something inside her that even she didn't yet know was there. She wanted to look away, to pretend she hadn't noticed him noticing her, but there was a gravity in the way he stood, like a mountain that demanded acknowledgement. The other trainees joked, adjusted their scopes, fired again. Some hit the target, some didn't. She felt like she had stumbled into a world where precision ruled and brute strength meant nothing. As she packed her rifle away, telling herself that maybe shooting wasn't her thing, the SEAL finally approached. His voice when he spoke wasn't loud. It was low, steady, and somehow more piercing than any shout could have been. "You're fighting the rifle," he said, his tone not accusing but matter-of-fact. "At close range you can muscle through mistakes. Out here the rifle will beat you every time." She opened her mouth to explain, to defend herself, but the words caught. He had already read her without needing an explanation. Instead, she found herself asking, almost against her will, "Then how do I stop fighting it?" His mouth twitched, the barest hint of a smile. "You learn to listen to it. You learn patience. And if you're willing, I can teach you." It was a strange proposition, almost too simple, but something in his tone made her heart tighten. She nodded before she could talk herself out of it. That was the day everything began. The day she stopped being a brawler and started the slow, grueling transformation into something else entirely. The next morning, she met him at the range before sunrise, the world still cloaked in a gray haze that softened the edges of everything. He was already there, crouched beside a rifle that looked heavier, longer, and far more complicated than the one she had been struggling with the day before. He didn't waste time with greetings, and she found herself mirroring his silence as she walked up, tightening the strap of her vest and trying to shake off the drowsiness that clung to her body. He handed her the rifle without a word, and the weight of it surprised her. It felt alive, like a coiled predator resting in her palms. When she looked at him, expecting instructions, he simply nodded toward the prone mat laid out before them. She lay down awkwardly, trying to copy the stance she'd seen others use, but the buttstock dug into her shoulder at an odd angle and her legs felt twisted. He crouched beside her and adjusted her with the same calm precision he used for everything, pulling her elbow closer to the ground, aligning her spine, tilting her head just so until the scope framed the target in perfect balance. Only then did he speak, and his words were slow, deliberate, as if each one mattered. "You're trying to control everything," he said. "Shooting long range isn't about control, it's about surrender. You can't force the shot. You have to let it happen." The concept rattled around in her mind, foreign and frustrating. Surrender was not in her vocabulary. She had built her life around being stronger, faster, more relentless. Yet as she inhaled, the scope wobbled and the target swam in and out of focus. Her instinct screamed at her to clamp down, to muscle it steady, but his voice cut through her panic. "Stop fighting. Breathe. Let your heartbeat settle. Listen." So she tried. She let the air slide slowly into her lungs, felt the thrum of her pulse in her fingertips, and focused not on the bullseye but on the rhythm of her body against the earth. The crosshairs steadied almost on their own, drifting like a boat on calm water. For a fleeting second, everything aligned. She squeezed. The shot cracked, the recoil surged, and the target, still far too close to impress him, pinged with a neat hole near the center. A rush of warmth flooded her chest, a fragile, dizzying pride that she quickly tamped down, because his expression barely changed. He only gave a short nod as if to say, "That's the beginning, nothing more." The hours stretched on, each one blending into the next as he drilled her in fundamentals she had never considered. She learned how wind wasn't just an enemy but a partner, how it carried secrets across the range and demanded respect. She learned that every bullet was a question, and the environment always answered before the steel did. When her arms ached, when her eyes blurred, when she thought she couldn't hold the rifle 1 second longer, he made her keep going, not with shouting or threats, but with that unyielding calm that somehow pushed her harder than any barked command. By the end of the day, her body was raw, her shoulder bruised, her mind exhausted. But as she sat on the gravel, wiping sweat from her brow, she realized she was hungry, not just for food, but for more of whatever he was unlocking inside her. He crouched beside her then, finally letting a trace of warmth into his voice. Long-range shooting is about trust, he said. You trust the rifle. You trust your training. And most of all, you trust yourself. Out there, 2 kilometers away, you'll never see the man you're aiming at breathe, never hear him move. The only thing between you and him is trust. She looked at him, at the sharp lines of his weathered face and the calm certainty in his eyes, and for the first time she believed that maybe she could do this, that maybe, just maybe, she could reach farther than she had ever imagined. As the sun dipped low and the range emptied around them, he finally asked, "You still want to learn?" Her answer came without hesitation, stronger than anything she had said all day. Yes. And when his gaze met hers, steady and unflinching, she understood that she had just made a promise not only to him but to herself. A promise that would carry her from clumsy 20-meter failures to the impossible distances she hadn't yet dared to dream of. The following day began before the sun had even thought about breaking the horizon, the kind of early hour where the world still seemed caught between silence and anticipation, and she found herself walking toward the range with heavier steps than she expected. She had hardly slept, replaying his words in her head, wondering if she had really agreed to something she was capable of, wondering if she would once again embarrass herself in front of a man who carried a presence forged by years of battles she could hardly imagine. He was already there when she arrived, crouched in that same quiet way, as though he had been waiting not for minutes but for hours, his rifle laid out. Across a mat, his posture calm, eyes hidden behind those dark lenses that seemed to see more than any human should. He didn't greet her, didn't soften the moment with casual words, just gestured with a tilt of his head toward the rifle beside him, a weapon that looked far more serious than the clumsy training piece she had been fumbling with the day before. She lowered herself to the mat with clumsy determination, the gravel biting into her knees, the air cool enough that her breath rose faintly in the stillness. The rifle was heavier than it looked, a beast of metal and optics and power, and for a second she wondered if he expected her to fail just to prove how much she had to learn. She tried to settle into the prone position she remembered from watching others, but immediately it was wrong. Her elbow floating too high, her cheek too tense against the stock, her breathing shallow with nerves. Without a word, he adjusted her, guiding her elbow down until it rooted into the earth, pressing her spine into alignment, shifting her head so the scope framed the world in a way that suddenly felt less chaotic. His movements were efficient but not rushed, hands steady, his voice finally breaking the silence with words as precise as his touch. "Stop trying to control the rifle. Control is the first mistake. Long range isn't about domination, it's about surrender." She frowned at the word, surrender, because surrender was something she had never allowed herself. Her life had been about pushing harder, holding tighter, overpowering whatever stood in front of her. But here, pressed to the ground with the scope reflecting back the distant target, she understood that force only scattered her, made her tremble with wasted energy. "Breathe," he said again, softer this time, and she obeyed, inhaling slowly, feeling her chest expand, the air cool and heavy in her lungs. The crosshairs steadied with her breath, drifting not from panic but from rhythm, and for the first time the rifle seemed less like an enemy and more like an extension of her heartbeat. She squeezed the trigger, not jerking, not forcing, just letting it happen, and the crack split the morning air as the bullet tore down range and struck the steel with a sharp, undeniable ping that echoed back like a distant affirmation. She blinked, hardly believing she had done it, but before she could speak, his voice was there again, calm, almost dismissive. "That's one. Now do it again." And so she did, again and again, each shot carving away the rough edges of her impatience, each failure corrected not with scolding but with a steady reminder to trust the process. Hours passed like minutes. He showed her how to read the wind not as an obstacle but as part of the conversation, how mirage rising off the ground in the afternoon heat bent light and tricked the eye, how even the weight of the bullet, the curve of the earth, and the timing of her own pulse shaped the outcome. She discovered that shooting long range was not about pulling a trigger but about mastering 1,000 tiny variables that most people would never even notice. At first it overwhelmed her, the sheer impossibility of balancing so much at once, but then she saw how he treated it like breathing, like a dance he had done so many times that each step lived in his bones. When her arms trembled from fatigue and her shoulder burned from the recoil, when sweat dripped into her eyes and blurred the world into streaks of color, he didn't tell her to stop. He simply crouched beside her, voice low, "Pain means you're pushing past your limits. Don't waste it." And so she pressed on, even as the world narrowed to the smell of gunpowder and dust, the throb of muscle and the steady crack of rifles echoing across the range. By the time the sun slid low and painted the horizon in amber light, she was spent, every part of her body screaming for rest. She dropped to the gravel beside the mat, chest heaving, face streaked with grime, and yet beneath the exhaustion was something strange and powerful: hunger. Not for food, not even for rest, but for more of whatever this was. This discipline that asked her to be sharper than she had ever been, this skill that demanded everything but promised something vast in return. He crouched beside her at last, and this time his voice carried not only instruction but a weight she could feel in her bones. "Out there, when you're lying in the dirt and your target is more than 2 kilometers away, you'll never see his chest rise, never hear him breathe. You'll have nothing but your trust. Trust in the rifle. Trust in the shot. Trust in yourself. If you can't find that, distance will always win." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw not just the soldier but the quiet certainty of a man who had lived his words, who had trusted at distances most would never dare, who had faced that silence and come back from it. She realized with sudden clarity that this wasn't just training, it was a transformation, a chance to strip herself down and rebuild into someone who could reach farther than fear. When he asked finally, his voice softer than she expected, "Do you still want to learn?" her answer came before doubt could even form, her voice steady, firm, almost fierce, "Yes." And in the fading light, with his gaze locked on hers, she understood she had crossed a line she could never uncross, that the woman who had once thrived only in close quarters had chosen a path that would lead her farther than she ever imagined, into a world where precision and patience ruled, and where one day she might place a bullet exactly where it needed to land at 2,300 meters. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of discipline and discomfort, a cycle of early mornings, endless drills and lessons that stretched her patience until she felt as if she might snap, only to realize at the end of each day that she had grown sharper in ways she hadn't known were possible. At first, she counted progress only in shots that rang true against the steel, small victories that felt like fleeting sparks in a storm of mistakes, but gradually she began to notice changes that were quieter, deeper, hidden beneath the surface. Her breathing grew steadier, her body learned to settle into the ground instead of fighting it, her mind stopped chasing the target and started listening to it, letting her awareness expand until even the faintest breeze across her cheek told her something about the bullet's path. The SEAL rarely praised her outright, but she came to crave those small nods of acknowledgement, the almost imperceptible curve of his mouth when she did something right. He demanded not perfection but persistence, drilling her with questions she couldn't yet answer. "What is the wind telling you? How far is the mirage bending? How long since your last breath?" At first she stumbled over them, frustrated that she couldn't juggle so many variables at once, but gradually the questions became part of her rhythm, forcing her to open her senses to a world she had never noticed before. It was humbling, almost humiliating, to realize how much she had relied on strength alone in the past, and yet exhilarating to discover that patience and awareness could be as lethal as fists or blades. One evening, after a particularly grueling session where her shots had scattered in a wide, disappointing pattern across the steel, she slammed her fist against the mat in anger, the sound echoing like a gunshot. In the twilight, he didn't flinch, didn't chastise her, just crouched down beside her and said in that maddeningly calm voice, "You're still trying to win every shot. Long range isn't about winning. It's about waiting for the one that matters." The words dug into her like hooks, forcing her to confront the truth that she had been treating each bullet as if it had to prove her worth, when in reality the skill was about conserving, calculating, and striking at the right moment, not every moment. That night she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, realizing that his lessons were bleeding into every part of her life. She had always been restless, impatient, quick to act, but here was a craft that punished impatience more brutally than any opponent ever had. Slowly she began to shift, to let go of the urge to dominate each second and instead lean into the stillness, the waiting, the long silence between heartbeats. Weeks passed and her shots began to stretch farther. 100 meters became 2, 2 became 5, 5 became 8. Each new distance felt impossible at first, the target shrinking into something almost abstract, a speck dancing in the scope's lens, but each time he was there, guiding her, reminding her that distance was not an enemy but an equation, one she could solve if she trusted herself enough. She learned to calculate the drop of the bullet, to time her squeeze with the pause between heartbeats, to read the shift of the world around her as if nature itself were whispering the answers. And with each breakthrough came an unexpected transformation. She no longer felt like the woman who had been clumsy at 20 meters, frustrated and lost. She was becoming something else, someone steadier, quieter, dangerous in a way she had never known before. The moment that confirmed it came late one afternoon, the light golden, the air still, the range almost empty except for the two of them. He set up a target at a distance she had never attempted, farther than she thought possible, a distance that made her throat tighten just to imagine bridging it. "You're ready," he said, handing her the rifle with that same steady look, and though doubt flared in her chest, his certainty anchored her. She lay down, settled in, let the earth hold her weight, and began the process she had drilled so many times it felt etched into her bones. Check the wind, watch the mirage, measure the distance, breathe, wait. The target shimmered in the scope, distant, unreal, and for a long moment she thought she had no chance. But then she remembered his words, the ones he had repeated in different ways every day since they had begun. Trust. She let the trust fill her, let go of the need to prove herself with every shot, let the silence stretch until her heartbeat slowed to a rhythm she could ride. And then she squeezed, the rifle bucked, the echo rolled across the range, and after a pause that felt like an eternity, the faintest ping carried back on the air. She blinked, certain she had imagined it, but when she looked at him she saw the nod, the ghost of a smile, the rarest flicker of approval. She had made the shot. Not at 2,300 meters yet, not even close, but farther than she had ever thought possible, and the rush that filled her veins was not the wild triumph of a brawler winning by brute force but the quiet, steady pride of someone who had surrendered to patience and been rewarded. That night, lying in her bunk, every muscle aching, she realized she was no longer chasing the skill because she wanted to prove herself to him. She was chasing it because it was transforming her into someone she never thought she could be. Someone who could wait, who could trust, who could strike across distances that once seemed untouchable. And deep down she knew this was only the beginning. By the time the first month of training had bled into the second, she had lost track of how many hours she had spent on the mat, how many times she had pulled the trigger, how many moments of frustration and near collapse had been quietly pulled back into focus by the calm, steady presence of the SEAL who refused to let her quit. What surprised her most wasn't the bruises or the fatigue, those were expected, but the way her perception of the world itself had begun to change. She noticed the way leaves on a tree shifted just slightly before a breeze reached her skin, how heat rising off asphalt distorted the air in waves that bent everything behind it, how sound carried differently depending on the density of the atmosphere. It was as though she had been half-blind her whole life and only now was she learning to see, the rifle acting as a teacher that revealed truths too subtle for her old self to have noticed. Every lesson was a grind, but every lesson also cracked something open inside her. One morning, after hours of drilling, he set up a new challenge. Targets scattered at different distances, each requiring different calculations, different adjustments, different levels of patience. She balked at first, staring through the scope at the tiny shapes glinting under the sun, feeling overwhelmed by the sheer number of factors she would have to juggle. But he said nothing, just folded his arms and waited, letting the silence weigh on her until she realized he wasn't going to make it easier. So she began, fumbling at first, rushing the first few shots and missing by wide margins. Anger surged in her chest, hot and wild, the same anger that had fueled her in close combat, but this time it betrayed her, shaking her hands, tightening her breath. She lowered the rifle, ready to curse, ready to throw it aside, but then his voice came, calm, unhurried, the anchor she didn't want but needed. You can't fight distance with rage. The farther the shot, the calmer you must be. Rage burns fast. Patience lasts. She wanted to argue, but deep down she knew he was right. She pressed her cheek back to the stock, let the scope frame the horizon, and forced herself to breathe. Slowly, carefully, she began to work through the shots one at a time, adjusting for wind, adjusting for drop, adjusting for the shift in her own pulse. It was excruciatingly slow, but one by one the targets fell, steel ringing across the range until even she was surprised by how many she had hit. When she looked up, sweat dripping into her eyes, she saw him nod, and though it was a small gesture, it carried more weight than any applause could have. In that moment she realized he wasn't training her to be a good shot. He was training her to be unshakable, to build a foundation so solid that no matter how chaotic the world around her became, she could always find the stillness at the center. Days like that became the norm, challenges that seemed impossible until she broke them down, failures that taught her more than successes ever could. Her body toughened, her mind sharpened, her patience deepened. And yet, the greater the distances she reached, the more she understood how far she still had to go. The 2,300-meter mark loomed in her mind like a mountain peak lost in clouds, visible, daunting, almost mythical. She didn't speak of it, not even to him, but she knew he had placed it there, That every exercise, every correction, every moment of quiet observation was pushing her toward that summit. One evening, as they packed up after a long day, she asked him a question that had been gnawing at her since the beginning. "Why me?" she said, her voice low, almost hesitant. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before finally answering, "Because you were willing to fail. Most people quit when they see themselves fall short. You kept coming back." She let his words settle into her, heavy and strange, realizing that her failures had been the very thing that kept her in the game. That night she lay awake, staring into the darkness, feeling something new burning inside her. Not just determination but belief. Belief that maybe, just maybe, she could be the one to make the impossible shot. And when the morning came and she returned to the range, she carried that belief with her, quiet but steady, as if it had been there all along waiting to be discovered. The march toward mastery did not come with a single breakthrough or dramatic triumph but through 1,000 small battles fought in silence, each one a test of her will against the demands of distance, patience, and the relentless standard he set for her without ever raising his voice. By the 5th week, the rifle no longer felt like a foreign weight in her hands but an extension of herself, its cold steel and glass merging with her senses until she could almost feel the wind tugging at the bullet's path before she fired, could almost sense the earth's curve beneath her shot. Yet for every moment of clarity, there were still failures, misses that stung her pride, miscalculations that left her gnashing her teeth, days when her body screamed at her to stop and her mind wanted to quit more than it wanted to succeed. He never let her indulge in excuses. Instead, he pushed her deeper, not with cruelty but with the same quiet certainty that had unnerved her since the beginning. One particularly brutal day, when the sun blazed overhead and the heat shimmered in waves across the ground, he led her farther than they had ever gone before, a stretch of range that seemed to disappear into the horizon. "This," he said simply, pointing to a target barely visible in the scope, "is beyond most. But you're ready to taste it." She swallowed hard, lying down on the mat, adjusting the bipod, feeling the gravel press into her elbows. The distance was dizzying, the target nothing more than a speck quivering in the mirage, and for a moment doubt clawed at her throat. She wanted to say it was too far, that she wasn't ready, but the words died when she saw his expression. Calm, unwavering, filled with the quiet knowledge that she could do more than she believed. So she began the process, every step etched into her muscle memory now. Measure the wind, watch the flicker of heat rising from the ground, calculate the drop, slow her breathing, wait for the stillness between heartbeats. The world narrowed to the scope, to the tiny piece of steel glinting impossibly far away. She pressed the trigger, the rifle thundered, and then came the long silence, the space between cause and effect stretched to the breaking point. Finally, faintly, the ping returned, so soft she thought she imagined it. She looked up, searching his face, and saw the smallest smile, fleeting but real. "Now," he said, "you understand patience." The shot didn't make her arrogant. It humbled her more than any miss had, because it showed her how vast the distance still was, how much farther she had to go before she could ever dream of reaching 2,300 meters. That evening, as they cleaned the rifles in silence, she asked him if he remembered his own first long shot, the one that had changed him. For a moment his hands stilled, his eyes distant, and then he said, "I remember the silence before it. The silence is always the same no matter how far. You learn to live in it." She carried that phrase with her, turning it over in her mind again and again, until it became a mantra, a reminder that this path was not about noise or recognition but about embracing silence so deep it could carry a bullet across impossible distances. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months, and still she pushed forward, each new distance conquered only sharpening her hunger for the next. She found herself noticing changes in who she was outside the range too, her temper shorter in bursts but steadier in crises, her movements slower but sharper, her awareness of her surroundings heightened to a degree that startled even her. Friends began to remark on how she had changed, how she seemed calmer, more deliberate, as though the discipline of the rifle had seeped into her bones. She didn't tell them about the endless hours of sweat, about the bruises on her shoulder, about the nights she lay awake replaying every mistake until exhaustion claimed her. She didn't tell them about the seal either, not really, because trying to explain him felt impossible. He was more than a teacher, less than a friend, something in between that was carved out of discipline and silence. And deep down she suspected that what bound them wasn't words but the trust that had grown unspoken between them, a trust forged by thousands of shots, by the shared silence that stretched across each pull of the trigger. One evening, after a particularly grueling day when she had pushed herself to the edge of collapse, she sat staring at the horizon, the rifle laid across her lap, and he sat beside her, quiet as ever. Finally he said, Do you know what makes a marksman different from a shooter? She shook her head, too tired to guess. A shooter fires bullets. A marksman fires decisions. Every round has weight. Every shot has consequence. At long range, you're not pulling a trigger, you're reaching into someone else's world. The words chilled her because for the first time she understood the gravity of what she was learning. It wasn't just skill, it was responsibility, the kind of responsibility that could never be shrugged off once accepted. And as she looked at the horizon, the sun dipping low, painting the sky in shades of fire, she realized she was no longer training just to hit a target. She was training to carry the weight of those decisions, to one day place a round exactly where it was meant to go, no matter how far the distance, no matter how heavy the silence that followed. By the time she entered the 6th month of training, the range no longer intimidated her the way it once had. Instead it beckoned, each distance a challenge she craved, each shot an opportunity to dive deeper into the silence that had become both her torment and her salvation. The transformation was so complete that she barely recognized the woman who had once struggled at 20 meters, gripping the rifle like an enemy and flinching at every recoil. Now her body settled into position as if it had always belonged there, her breathing slow, her pulse measured, her senses stretched outward until she felt tethered to the world in ways she couldn't explain. The SEAL noticed too, though he rarely said so directly. Instead he tested her in new ways, never warning her in advance, sometimes calling out adjustments mid-breath, sometimes forcing her to calculate wind on instinct, sometimes setting up targets so far apart she had to completely reset her thinking between shots. At first she resented the constant curveballs, the way he refused to let her settle into comfort, but eventually she understood. He was teaching her that mastery wasn't about repeating what you knew, it was about adapting to what you didn't. The hardest day came when he led her to a ridge she hadn't trained on before, a place where the ground fell away into rolling valleys and the wind curled unpredictably through the terrain. He set the target at nearly 2 kilometers, farther than she had ever attempted, and told her simply, "Find the shot." It stared at him, certain he was joking, but his face was carved with the same calm certainty as always. So she lay down, set the rifle, and began to work through the process. Every calculation felt slippery, every adjustment uncertain. The wind shifted between gusts and lulls, the mirage bent in strange patterns, and the distance loomed like an impossible gulf. She missed the first shot by dozens of meters, the round burying itself uselessly in the dirt, and frustration burned hot in her chest. But before she could spiral into anger, his voice anchored her. "Patience. Don't chase the miss. Find the silence again." She exhaled, steadied herself, and tried again. The second shot missed too, but closer this time. Then the third, closer still. By the fourth, she could feel the rhythm settling, her body no longer fighting but flowing with the rifle, with the wind, with the earth itself. When the fifth shot finally rang out and the faint, delayed ping carried back across the valley, she felt tears sting her eyes, not from joy but from the sheer weight of it, the knowledge that she had stretched across nearly 2 kilometers and touched the unreachable. She looked at him then, half expecting some rare word of praise, but all he said was, "You're learning to trust the long silence." And he was right. More than the hit itself, it was the waiting that had defined the moment, the long pause where doubt screamed and patience whispered, where she had chosen trust over fear. That night, lying awake under a ceiling she barely noticed anymore, she thought about how far she had come and how much farther she still wanted to go. The 2,300-meter mark loomed closer now, not as a fantasy but as a possibility, a peak hidden in mist that she could almost see. But along with the hunger came something else, an awareness of the weight of what she was becoming. This wasn't just about hitting steel plates or proving herself against distance. This was about responsibility, about holding in her hands the power to end something from farther than the eye could see. One evening, after a long session, she asked him if he had ever regretted a shot, if the silence afterward had ever haunted him. He didn't answer at first, just stared out at the horizon where the sun was bleeding into the earth, his face carved with something harder than usual. Finally he said, "Every marksman carries ghosts. The question isn't whether you'll have them, it's whether you'll let them own you." She didn't press further, but the words stayed with her, heavy and unshakable, as if warning her of what lay beyond skill and patience. And yet, despite the weight, she knew she wouldn't turn back. The discipline had reshaped her, carved her into someone who could face the silence without flinching, someone who could stretch across impossible distances and trust herself to find the mark. The SEAL saw it too, and though he rarely said much, one evening as they packed up he finally looked at her with an expression that almost broke his usual calm. "You're closer than you think," he said simply, and she realized he wasn't just talking about the distance to the target. The day she finally faced the 2,300-meter shot arrived without announcement, slipped into her life like any other, the sun hanging low and pale over the range, the air carrying a stillness that seemed to demand something extraordinary. She had been training for months with the distance inching farther, the challenges piling higher, each one sharpening her until there was no trace left of the woman who had once panicked at the idea of hitting a target across a room. When the SEAL drove her out to the plateau where the final setup waited, she recognized at once that this was different. The terrain stretched endlessly, dry hills spilling into valleys, mirages swimming in the heat, and at the farthest point, so distant it looked no larger than a scratch on the earth, sat the target, a steel plate perched like a dare against the horizon. The number weighed heavy in her chest, 2,300 meters, and though she had whispered it to herself 100 times before, now it seemed enormous, almost mythic. He said little as he set up the rifle, his practiced hands moving with quiet efficiency, and when he finally stepped back, he looked at her with that calm, unblinking gaze she had come to both rely on and fear. "You've already done the work," he said, voice steady, carrying no room for doubt. "Now you let it happen." She lay prone, the rifle firm against her shoulder, her cheek pressed against the stock, and she began the ritual that had become her anchor. Breath slow, heartbeat steady, mind stretching outward until the world narrowed into the long corridor of distance between her and the plate. The wind was fickle, brushing across the plateau in uneven strokes, tugging at the grass and shifting the mirage like rippling glass, but instead of panicking she let herself absorb it, watching the subtle patterns, listening to the faint whistle at the edges of her hearing. She made her calculations, adjusted her scope, dialed for elevation, but more than numbers it was instinct now, a marriage of science and silence. Her first shot cracked across the distance, the recoil steady, and then came the long wait, the eternal pause where time felt suspended, where the bullet was invisible yet alive, carrying her trust across the air. It struck wide, a puff of dust rising harmlessly to the left. She exhaled, unfazed, made the adjustment, fired again. This time closer, the impact a teasing mist that only sharpened her focus. She fired a third, then a fourth, each shot pulling her deeper into the trance where nothing existed but her and the horizon. Sweat stung her eyes, her muscles ached from the stillness, but she held steady, every cell in her body aligned to the single task of reaching what once felt unreachable. The fifth shot felt different even before the trigger broke. It was the quiet inside her, the way her breath left her lungs as if it had always belonged to the wind, the way her pulse seemed to stop for the briefest instant as the rifle bucked against her. The pause afterward stretched forever, her eyes locked on the target, and then the sound came, the faint, unmistakable ping that carried back like a promise fulfilled. For a second she didn't move, didn't breathe, almost didn't believe it had happened. Then it crashed over her, not in shouts or triumph but in something deeper, heavier, a profound stillness that told her she had crossed into a place few ever reached. She lowered the rifle slowly, her hands trembling now that the trance had broken, and turned to the SEAL. He was watching her, face unreadable as always, but there was something in his eyes this time, a flicker of acknowledgement, maybe even pride. "That's the silence," he said, the words as soft as the wind. She wanted to smile, to cry, to laugh all at once, but instead she just nodded because she understood now, understood what he had been building her toward all along. It wasn't just the distance, wasn't just the mark on the plate. It was the patience to wait, the trust to release, the resilience to accept the miss and keep pressing forward. It was becoming someone who could stretch herself into the impossible and not break. They packed up in silence, and as they drove back across the fading light, she stared out the window at the endless horizon, her mind buzzing not with the victory but with the weight of it. The shot was hers. Forever now, etched into the marrow of her being, but it was also a reminder, a burden of precision and discipline, of what it meant to hold power at that distance. She thought of his words about ghosts, about carrying them without letting them own you, and she knew that someday, perhaps sooner than she wanted, she would have to face what that really meant. For now, though, as the truck bumped along the dirt road and the sun sank behind them, she allowed herself the smallest smile, a quiet acknowledgement of the journey from trembling novice to marksman of impossible range. She had found the silence, and in it she had found herself. The months after that fateful shot unfolded not in the dramatic blaze of triumph she once imagined but in a quieter, more deliberate rhythm that tested her in ways the trigger never had, because mastery at long range was never about a single day or a single hit, it was about the discipline to keep earning it every morning, every hour, every trigger pull, and that meant long hours at the range, repetition until her muscles burned. Meticulous cleaning of the rifle when the world slept, and the endless recalculations of variables that would never bend to arrogance. Wind, humidity, air pressure, the Earth's subtle rotation. All of them conspiring to test the margins of her will. The SEAL rarely congratulated her, even after she had carved her name at distances others only whispered about. Instead, he doubled her burdens, demanded she shoot in rain, in cold, in the disorienting shimmer of desert heat, demanded she adapt to shooting uphill, downhill, through crosswinds, through shifting light that blinded her scope, and though at times she cursed him, though her shoulders ached and her eyes blurred from strain, she began to recognize the strange kindness in his cruelty. He was shaping her not just to hit steel plates at impossible ranges but to be unshakable under chaos, to trust her skill when nothing felt certain, to embrace patience even when seconds meant survival. With each drill she absorbed more than mechanics. She began to live inside the silence he had spoken of, the silence that lived not in the absence of noise but in the stillness of her own mind, a clarity that could not be shaken even when the world around her cracked open. And then came the call neither of them had spoken about but both had been waiting for. An invitation, quiet and coded, delivered not with ceremony but with the heavy weight of responsibility. She was to accompany him, not as an observer, not as a trainee, but as his equal, into a situation that demanded a marksman who could not falter. The mission details were spare, the kind designed to conceal more than they revealed, but what mattered was clear. A target, far beyond ordinary range, in terrain that punished hesitation, in a window of time so narrow that any slip would shatter it. On the flight there, as the drone of the engines wrapped around her, she thought about the journey that had brought her here, the trembling woman who had once been afraid to fire at a paper silhouette 10 meters away, the exhaustion of nights where she nearly walked away, the sting of missed shots that echoed in her bones, and the patient, relentless man who had refused to let her settle for anything less than the edge of her potential. Now she was stepping into a crucible where all of it would either fuse into something enduring or fall apart. The insertion was silent, cloaked in the hush of practiced movements, and soon she found herself lying prone once more, only this time the stakes were no longer steel plates and personal victories but lives balanced on the weight of her finger. The distance stretched farther than she had ever tested in a live operation, 2,300 meters almost exactly, the same number that had haunted and then defined her, and though the target was blurred by shifting air, partially hidden by the architecture of a fortified compound, she felt no tremor, no fear, only the quiet pulse of readiness. The SEAL beside her said nothing. He didn't need to. Their silence was the language of trust now. She worked the scope, measured the drift of the wind through the rise of dust near the walls, accounted for the tilt of the earth beneath her, and when at last the shot broke, it was not a moment of violence but of release, as though the bullet had always been waiting to leave her hand, destined for its mark. The seconds stretched like an eternity, then the impact bloomed, clean and final, the ripple of reaction inside the compound confirming what her eyes already knew. The shot had landed true. The mission moved on without pause, the team advancing as though her contribution was as natural as breathing, and she remained at her post, cycling her breath, watching over them through her scope, guardian at a distance. When it was done, when the extraction carried them back into the cocoon of the aircraft, the SEAL finally looked at her, his face unreadable as always, but there was something different in his silence now, respect not as mentor to student, but as equal to equal. She didn't need words. The silence between them was enough. Later, when she returned to the solitude of her own quarters, the weight of what had transpired settled over her, not crushing, not heavy but grounding like roots sinking into earth. She realized she had crossed into a life where the line between ordinary and extraordinary no longer existed, where the skills she carried were as much responsibility as they were triumph. She was no longer the woman who had struggled at close range, no longer the trainee under the relentless gaze of a man forged by war. She was something else now, someone who had met the silence and carried it with her. And though she knew the world outside might never understand the discipline, the patience, the trust it took to lay still and reach across impossible distances, she carried it not for their recognition but for herself, for the journey she had survived, for the man who had believed in her enough to break her down and build her back sharper, stronger, steadier. In the days that followed, she would return to the range, continue the drills, refine the margins, because she understood now that mastery was never final, never complete. It was a horizon always receding, always asking for more. And she welcomed it because the silence was hers now, and in that silence lived not just the mark of a 2,300-meter shot, but the proof that she had become what even she once thought impossible. The end.